I like that applause, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the organisers for having me here tonight, and congratulations of course on the publication. As I was introduced, I'm a former student president, and I'm particularly impressed that a number of you have turned up tonight without the temptation of free booze. In fact, it was free orange juice and apple juice. This is an extremely important debate that we need to have in this country. Extremely important. In fact, energy policy hasn't been debated enough in Australia in the past, partly because we have a high volume of accessible energy resources. And before we go on to what I was actually going to say, I like competition. I don't know who these people are who don't like competition. If they're out there, certainly there are people who don't, and I know who they are, and they're big government and they're big business, and most of the arguments put forward by the previous spokesperson was problems around what happens when politicians get involved in the marketplace, where they prioritise their interests and their issues ahead of the interests of the marketplace and a freer marketplace. Certainly there is no free market. I agree with Ross on this. There are only freer markets, but when big business and big government get together, grab your wallet because they're coming after it. And that's what we're going to see, that's what we're seeing constantly in the space of energy. The market does send signals, actually, Ross, as well. I'm really fascinated by your example of multinational car manufacturers in Australia are going broke for a very simple reason. They're producing large cars that nobody wants. People want smaller cars. Why? Because they're more energy efficient. They require less energy input to actually operate. Why? Because they're actually affected by the price of petrol. Petrol is a price signal into the operation of a car. Now, I'm not arguing petrol prices are entirely driven by the marketplace, but it does have a big impact in terms of the situation. And of course, we've talked all about the terrible situation of profit. We can't have big companies making profit. In fact, we can't have anybody making profit, because profit happens when two people get together, or two agencies get together and exchange goods and services that they both want. There is nothing wrong with profit, and we shouldn't treat it as such, because it's actually a good thing. The only thing that is a problem is when we have profit that's come as a result of big government and big business getting together to screw over you. Now, no one's disputing that there isn't a role for government in creating a framework for the operation of markets and energy markets. Ross talked about that already. There are also issues around utilities constraints, which I recognise wholeheartedly government has a role in, particularly with relation to things like purchasing and acquiring certain amounts of land for the purposes of developing infrastructure, because only government can do that. Government actually has comparative advantage, if you're familiar with that broadly economic term. Governments have comparative advantage as well, where they can do things that other people cannot, where people choose not to do so. But that does not mean that there is an incredibly important role for the marketplace to operate as an effective means to deliver energy to people in the marketplace. We have to base it on the basis of something that is realistic, and what we have increasingly in energy policy is a focus on aspirational goals and fairy tale stories of what we think is realistic because of what sounds good to a certain number of constituencies in a political context. For instance, blocking the development of new coal-fired power stations when we're looking at actually making sure we can deliver appropriate and reliable sources of energy in the marketplace. We also need to develop our energy policy which constrains it at carbon price, so that it exists within the operation realistic carbon constraint, or the fact that there really actually isn't one at the moment. It should not be picking winners in an environment for who should operate in the marketplace and the different types of energy modes that should be operating in the marketplace. They should create a framework where the governments are neutral, and the marketplace ultimately decides what different types of fuels operate, because if we don't, there are serious consequences, and we only need to look at some really good examples of where that has occurred. In the United States and the European Union, there was a strong preference for biofuels because they thought that was better in terms of reducing CO2 footprint. Because biofuels redirects crop resources that can be used for food, yes, there were biofuels produced, but at the same time we saw a massive global price spike for food crops, which meant people starved in large parts of the world. There are very large unintended consequences as a result of bad government policy intervening in the marketplace. Then you have the more global aspirational goals like the development of new types of renewable energy. And of course, the beauty of this example is the cylinder case in the United States, where in the United States, the US government underwrote a $500 million loan guarantee for a company to produce renewable energy from solar. And yet somehow spectacularly, that company managed to lose $500 million without turning over a profit. Now, I don't know about you, but if you can't run a company and produce an output that is viable at $500 million before you even start, there are serious problems with what's happening in government. Because in reality, when governments try to pick winners, we're actually using the wrong phrase. They're picking losers. Because in the market, most companies will always go out to the marketplace to raise capital over government. It has less restrictions on it. People are more motivated by profit motive rather than political constraints. And when ultimately those companies go to governments for finance, it's because they can't get in the marketplace, because investors can't see a return, because it isn't a viable alternative. And we're about to repeat that, by the way, in this country under the Clean Energy Finance Corporation as a result of the carbon tax. I mean, it actually says something incredible about renewable energy, that at zero fuel cost, you can't actually produce viable energy to provide to the marketplace because the technology isn't there. And we spent a lot of time investing in that technology over years, and the companies have been doing so and putting their own capital in place. And the only way they've actually been viable in providing renewable energy is when it gets giant government support and subsidies to try and provide it onto the grid. And the people who pay for it, of course, are all those people like yourselves who pay your power bills. There's already so much incentive in the marketplace for the development of renewable technologies. We have high and rising global demand. We have massive capacity constraints in the medium to long term, as well as resource constraints. And of course, we have the bigger issue, which is global prices. The biggest risk we now face with the development of new types of technology and reliable electricity supply or energy supply in the marketplace is a direct consequence of government interference, particularly with relation to sovereign risk. Now, I talked already about how if you create a block in place for new coal-fired power stations, you will stop investment. But talking about local examples, we've also seen how bad government policy and changing government policy can affect things like the solar hot water scheme, which we saw only a few weeks ago. And now we're seeing it as a result of carbon price, which is very much an issue of sovereign risk for investment. Now, we hear a lot, I need to dismiss this myth that somehow a carbon price is a part of a market-based system. It's not. It's a regulatory intervention in the marketplace using the technology of a market. It is not free market. It uses the technology of a market to distribute pain across the entire economy. Now, it creates a whole number of issues around business certainty, which is necessary for large-scale investments in the energy sector. Previously, there was a serious issue around certainty with the absence of a carbon price. I don't dispute that. So long as that remained on the table as a realistic cost for businesses, that does government diminish attraction for investment into the marketplace. But we've replaced the uncertainty of whether it will exist with the uncertainty that's associated with the carbon price's trajectory, which now undermines investment. We had a carbon price starting on 1 July at $23, assuming we don't have high court challenges and everything, a carbon price of $23 per tonne of greenhouse gas emissions. But in order to get it to the point where you can actually see a viable transition from something like cheap coal, particularly in my state, Victoria, you need a carbon price of $40 to $70. Those aren't my numbers, they're from the Australian National University. Similar numbers, we calculate the IPA, and I haven't had a single dispute yet, is if you want something like solar thermal technology, you need a carbon price of around $250. They're very serious costs on top of the marketplace to provide a stable investment framework. And that is, of course, politically unsustainable. If people are unhappy about a carbon price of $23, what do you think they're going to be at when we have a carbon price of $40 to $70, let alone in the many hundreds of dollars? You can add on top of that the enormous problems around the European scheme, which is the only really comparable scheme where you could actually say that there's a price operating effectively, and of course they're nowhere near that, and as a consequence we need to put our carbon price in the international context, because emissions trading is a beautiful theoretical idea, but it requires every country broadly to do it, or certainly the major emitters, based on the idea that everybody will apportion property rights related to greenhouse gas emissions. It's a fantasy that it will actually happen. It will not, or certainly not in the near future, until we're much more capable of understanding and calculating emissions. If you ever want to do yourself a favour, go and study carbon accounting, as I did, and you will learn how fungible carbon calculations are for people's footprints, even at a large scale, and how you can't accurately record them. And when you do that, and when you put in it that there's enormous incentive, and I'm not talking, there is free riding incentive, but enormous incentive for countries to cheat, because it massively advantages their economy. The capacity to actually have tradable permits between schemes is extremely unlikely, and it creates a very serious problem for greenhouse gases and whether we're actually able to do so. So we can impose a local price for carbon, but it can only be reflective of a global price for a global issue. We've talked about markets and trading schemes that operate for more localised initiatives. I don't disagree with that, and they can be effective as an instrument, as a regulatory intervention. But it can only be done if it's proportionate to the challenge we face, and what we have is a global one. And when we consider the enormous incentives that already operate in the international context around constraint, and the provision of energy supply, introducing more government intervention won't actually improve the reliable supply of electricity. It will only hinder it. Thank you.